Welcome to a conversation on international affairs. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is William Rusher, a distinguished figure in the conservative movement in the United States. Mr. Rusher has been a television personality on the program The Advocates. He is a syndicated columnist. He's the author of numerous books on conservatism and the conservative movement in the United States. And he is recognized as a key figure in articulating the conservative agenda and implementing it through the support of leading conservative political figures. And of course, he was the publisher of the National Review.
Mr. 31 Rusher, years.
Welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you.
Where were you educated?
In the public schools of New York primarily, and Great Neck High School in New York. And then I went to Princeton just as the war was breaking out there. Managed to get, by a hurry-up process, get my degree before going off to serve. And then after the war, went to Harvard Law School and practiced law for 9 years before turning to a life of crime and becoming a magazine publisher.
I see, I see. And what did your education make you a conservative? What helped shape you?
No, it was nothing that dramatic. My father and mother were Republicans of no great special distinction, just that was the way they felt. My father's father had been a socialist all his life. Charles Rusher was a coal miner in western Indiana and a supporter of Eugene Debs, who came from Terre Haute. But my father went into business, became a Republican, and my mother was a Republican. And it so happened that Alf Landon, who was the Republican candidate in 1936, came from my mother's hometown, Independence, in southeastern Kansas. Not Independence, Missouri, Independence, Kansas. And when I found that out at age 13, you know who I was for. And when he lost so heavily, I think that gave me the impulse to get into politics and correct this ghastly error that the American people had made.
Were but you really began as a moderate Republican when,
yes,
when you were a young adult.
I was in college, I wrote my thesis on the progressive element in the Republican Party and dedicated it to Wendell Willkie. I was a big Willkie man. I think my feeling was not so much that I preferred one wing of the party over the other, as that I deeply preferred to have the party in office, and the only way I thought it could get there was by being a moderate party, which I think was true at that time. But after the war, when the Cold War broke out, I became a staunch Cold Warrior, and I watched with fascination and sympathy the investigations of the House Committee on American Activities and the Chambers Hiss controversy. So I was moving to the right, I would say, from that time forward, the late 1940s.
I got the sense from your book that the issue of anti-communism was really key during the Eisenhower period in pushing you further into the conservative movement.
The conservative movement really got started in the early 1950s, and it had three components: the libertarians and the Austrian School of Economics around von Mises and Hayek. That was one. Then there was the Burkean traditionalists, descended intellectually from Russell Kirk in this country. And while I read The Road to Serfdom and read Kirk's books, my own, you're quite right, my own introduction to the general subject was from the anti-communist sphere, and what might be called an operational anti-communism was the third main tributary of the conservative movement. The people who not only were opposed to the Soviet Union, but took the whole controversy seriously on a philosophical level and believed that the party represented a problem domestically as well as internationally.
Let's talk a minute about these three strands and why the libertarian strand first. Why do you think it resonated, or did it resonate with the American political culture?
Well, it resonated with a part of it, no question about that. Hayek's book got well noticed. It certainly was not in the mainstream at the time. It was resolutely swimming against the current and knew it.
And what was, state for us the major tenet there that was most important?
Well, the Hayek in general opposed the proposition that government planning was the way to construct an economy and with it a society. He did not believe in that. He thought that it led to all the wrong results. In a very short but very cogently and tersely argued book, he he demonstrated that. I remember one chapter was Why the Worst Get on Top, and he just plain explained why that was the case. The traditionalists, incidentally, the libertarians and the traditionalists had not all that much in common. They disagreed with each other on a great many things. The traditionalists, as the name implies, took as their intellectual father Edmund Burke and believed in the value of established tradition and order in a society. Their roots tended to be Catholic and continental and hierarchical, whereas the libertarians were individualist and perhaps around the Atlantic Rim a bit more. So there were real disagreements. Interestingly enough, when Young Americans for Freedom came along in the 1960s, they immediately split up into two blocks, the trads and the libs. I would go to speak at one of their conventions, and the caucus for the trads would be over there, and the caucus for the libs would be over here.
Now, what about the anti-communist strain? These other two were really imported from abroad. Would that be fair to say?
I think that's true.
Yeah,
they were really separate responses to the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. Yes, the intellectual developments.
But the anti-communist component was really indigenous. Would that be a fair statement or not?
No. Well, at least a great many of the most noted anti-communists were European immigrants, East European refugees of one sort or another. Although many of them also were American, and many, if not most, were former communists themselves. Whittaker Chambers, Frank Meyer, James Burnham, although he was never a communist, was a Trotskyist, and a very prominent one. So the anti-communists came along much later intellectually because they were a response to the communist revolution and the communist world enterprise as they saw it. And they believed that it had to be taken seriously and fought à outrance with everything.
And you said you were attracted by an operational anti-communism.
Well, I tried.
And that refers to the fact you actually served as a Senate investigator.
That's not why I used the word operational.
Yeah.
I was reaching for something to qualify the concept of anti-communism as rather more than just ordinary anti-communism. In other words, we took it as a specialty. And you're quite right. In my case, I became fascinated by the Communist Party and got to know many ex-communists, and became a good friend of Robert Morris, who was chief counsel to the Internal Security Subcommittee, and eventually asked me to be his associate counsel. So I did get into it operationally in the quite literal sense of the word. But yes, I did become active in that sense too in the battle.
And Eisenhower was a disappointment for you with regard to his dealing with that issue, right?
With regard to a great many things, including that issue. Eisenhower, I was very much for him. I was for Eisenhower and therefore against Taft in the battle of 1952 for the Republican nomination. But I was deeply disappointed in the kind of, one would have to almost say do-nothing presidency, the preside over it but don't touch it kind of presidency. They called the White House in those days the tomb of the well-known soldier.
Now, but that our historians now and political scientists are taking a different view of Eisenhower. Do you still hold that to your analysis which you just offered?
Well, I think it's true that Eisenhower was a craftier man than he was depicted as being at the time. The liberals, with their domination of the media, immediately moved in to depict him as a fool. And I suppose even the conservative critics of Eisenhower saw nothing wrong with going along with that idea. I don't think he was a fool. But on the other hand, I don't think that he had any deep understanding of where America could be led or should be led. I think he was an attempt by the Republicans to hold the office without doing much with it.
Now, about the time that we're now talking about, the 50s, National Review came into being. Right. Tell us a little about the background of that happening.
Well, there was a prior publication, a sort of a John the Baptist among conservative publications called the Freeman, which started, I think, in 1951, and which had a great many of the writers and personalities in it that later did come to National Review. Buckley not among them. He was just in and out of college at that time, down in Mexico for a while, working in the CIA, by the way. But the Freeman broke up after 1952 over the issue of Eisenhower versus Taft. It had a great many cooks making the broth over there, and it broke up. And so Willy Schlamm, who was one of the people in the breakup, came to Buckley and said, we need a new conservative journal of opinion. And the single greatest contribution Schlamm ever made to it, he said all the voting stock should be in one person's hand, preferably yours. So, and to make a long story short, the magazine was launched in November 1955. Buckley was both editor and publisher, but he very quickly found that it was too much of a load, and I was about to step down as associate counsel to the Internal Security Subcommittee. And when he invited me to leave the practice of the law and become publisher of National Review, I found it too tempting to resist and lived happily ever after.
And what is the importance of National Review for the conservative movement?
Well, as I described to you, it began with three separate contending and often disagreeing tributaries to this single stream. Mm-hmm. Somebody, to change the metaphor, had to make the lions and the bears and the tigers all lie down together. And I'll have to say for William Buckley that he proved a giant diplomat in that regard. He created out of these disparate tendencies the modern conservative movement, gave it its name, and then by virtue of his personality sort of put it on the map in terms of television, made people think, well, gosh, if a fellow this clever can be for it, maybe there's something to be said for it, worked out a great many of its formulations, refereed all its internal feuds, which were ghastly, and the fact, no question about it, that he had all the voting stock solved a lot of problems. even if I disagreed with him.
The importance of capitalism, I
yeah,
is that
well, you see, if I disagreed with him, I could give way peacefully, knowing that it was merely because he had the voting stock, not because he was right. I never conceded he was right on anything, you see, if I disagreed with him.
Now, I noticed in the introduction to one of your books, you emphasize that philosophically you feel that ideas really have to come first.
Well, they did in this case, no question about it. In the beginning was the word. We didn't have... Oh, there were some conservative senators. Taft had died in 1953. Styles Bridges was still around. William Nolan was minority leader. But there was nothing you could build on seriously, and until the conservative movement began to look like something you could refer to and apply the principles of to the determination of issues. And it was just as clear to me as can be that the period from 1955, when National Review was launched, until 1960, was the period of creating the intellectual movement. But by 1960, it had done everything it could do simply as an intellectual movement. And something had to bring it into politics. And most of the people who were in it had no gift for politics. They were professors or ex-communists of one sort and another with little marginal jobs. And where were the politicians? Well, the Lord provides. At that point, a whole group of bright young men started the Conservative Party of New York. Another group launched what turned into the draft Goldwater movement. Certain politicians like Goldwater, and indeed Nolan and Jenner and others, were willing to identify with us and encourage us and speak for us to some extent. And as we know, Goldwater eventually got the nomination, and as I say in the book, far from being the great tragedy which that you might think by Goldwater's defeat by Johnson it was, 64 was an almost indispensably seminal year. Mm-hmm. It was the year we got control of the Republican Party. It was the year that we established the mailing lists. They had to be created and filed with various clerks of Congress and so on. And Goldwater got more small contributions than any presidential candidate up to that time had ever received. So here we were suddenly with mailing lists that could be computerized and used in senatorial campaigns in the future. Money raising of all sorts, and then last but far from least, a certain actor slightly over the hill made a speech for Goldwater, and the next thing you know, he was governor of California by 1 million votes.
And thus the movement began. What were the social dynamics, do you think, in the country that entered into this
very good question, and I think a very clear answer to it. The conservative movement as of 1960 certainly was in a position to make a case to the country for less government and for a solid resistance to the communists and perhaps for an honoring of tradition. But that would not in itself have necessarily changed a lot. What happened at that time was that the whole cultural counter-revolution came along, the sexual revolution, the uprise in drugs, the flood of pornography, the increase in the Vietnam War, eventually toward the end of the decade particularly. So the New Left was on the scene. Now, the New Left tends to think of the 1960s as their decade, and perhaps it was, but I also happen to think that the conservatives got 100,000 votes per riot straight through the 1960s. And you can see the transformation. A whole group of blue-collar, formerly Democratic or independent voters swung away from their Democratic affiliation. They stopped worrying so much about economics and began worrying more about what was happening to their country, what was happening to the family values. And they're still worried about that. And they became a new part of this coalition, and I might add a big voting chunk of this coalition. Still later, or no, about that same time, the neoconservatives, a small but very influential group of New York intellectual liberals, moved over, again in resistance to the New Left. In the late 1970s, the religious right signed aboard, again with a large number of new voters, so that the movement got larger numerically. But to answer your question, the social dynamic was when the swing vote, I would put it at 20% of the American electorate, shifted in about 1965 or 6 or 7 from the Democrats to either to an independent candidacy like Wallace or into a Republican coalition.
If Nixon had not fallen as a result of Watergate, do you think he would have been able to co-opt the sting of the movement, or would you consider him to have been a true conservative?
No, I never considered him a true conservative, and he was very late in understanding the depth or importance of the conservative movement. But he does say in his memoirs, written about 1976, that he intended in his second term to turn the Republican Party into the party of the new majority. He now retrospectively begins seeing how important it was, and I don't know how truly, identifies himself as having had that intention. As we know, he never got the chance to act on it if he had it, because he got booted by Watergate instead. But he wasn't just, I agree with you that up until then he had been co-opting and very successfully diminishing the impact of the conservative movement. I was furious with him. I didn't even vote for him in 1972, didn't vote for anybody, for president. But it may be that he finally got the word there and realized, because he says it several times, I intended to turn the new Republican Party along new majority lines.
What about the development in the late 70s of think tanks such as the Heritage Foundation? That is where we were now moving to a real development of a conservative program with an agenda with the particulars. Was that also a new thrust here in this?
Yes, it was. The sequence was first the word, the 55 to 60, then the turn to politics from 60 roughly to 70. And then in the, not just the late 70s, even in the early 70s, the Heritage Foundation began about 1973, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, that early?
Yeah. Yes, the 70s, the thing proliferated unbelievably. When I wrote my book, which was supposed to be a history of this whole thing, and got to the period of the 70s, it just got out of hand. I knew I could not do justice to all the things that were happening. I almost totally forgot about Phyllis Schlafly, had to put in a last-minute paragraph on the subject of her impact on the women's movement, which was enormous, of course, all of which happened in the 70s. That was, I would say, in retrospect, we didn't see it coming, but a lot of people were getting interested in conservatism by then, and they would pick out their particular topic and concentrate on that. We had committees, and still have, on everything, every conceivable subject. Legal foundations, testing things in the courts, campaign schools to train managers and candidates, journalistic schools to train young conservative journalists, separate committees on Africa, on Asia, on Latin America, on tax limitation, everybody doing his thing, and it all proliferated during the 1970s. I think it was the function of the larger number of people involved.
And then President Reagan emerges, of course, over the 70s, but his candidacy, I guess, becomes most serious at the end of the decade. What did he bring to this effort as a political leader?
I think of Nixon as a sad detour. Reagan was elected governor of California in 1966. He was kind of sensitive about therefore running for president in 68. He wasn't sure people would feel he had been blooded enough. But I wanted him to run, and eventually he did try hard in 68 and almost defeated Nixon for the nomination then. Then he tried again in 76, and as we know was very narrowly defeated by Ford for the nomination, who then proceeded to lose the election. So Reagan was delayed, but Reagan was the man who took a movement that had everything else. By that time, even money, which was the last thing to arrive, and gave it that keystone of the arch, the national spokesman, a man perfectly capable of communicating superbly with the American people who believed deeply in the movement. I was sometime believing even that he was a truly movement conservative. I came to know him and to know that he is. He really cared for the movement. He had been a subscriber to National Review since 1960, in fact, a very, very faithful one. So one has to say that the movement obviously would have amounted to something in any case, but the Lord just provided Ronald Reagan.
And what were his media skills that he had developed as a movie star and in Hollywood? I mean, was that a key element?
Very much.
Yeah.
Bill Buckley is a wonderful speaker and fascinates people, but he has this rather arch English style about him.
Eastern establishment.
Yeah. And Reagan comes across quintessentially as a perfect way of putting things. He has a great ear for the right way to put a thing. His speechwriters have told me that he would often change things that they wrote down, and invariably for the better in that regard, to make them simpler, make them more intelligible, make them more colorful. And then it doesn't hurt either to be a man who never treads on his own lines the way George Bush does. Bush is often halfway into the next sentence before the applause starts for the last sentence, you know. And then he's in a terrible tangle. Reagan knows just where to stop and how long to wait, and then to tell the next little wisecrack and let the penny drop at exactly the right moment. And you know, these are skills that you get as an actor, no question about it.
Do you think that Reagan, once he came in, was more pragmatic than you would have expected? Was he ever a disappointment in the early years? And if he was he responsible or the people around him?
He wasn't a disappointment to me. You must distinguish here. I know plenty of conservatives who were deeply disappointed in him. I don't think most by a long shot, but I know individual conservatives for whom Reagan was just no good at all. I didn't feel that way. I felt that I understood the difference between a theoretical position I could occupy, or saying something on this program, and running for and becoming and serving as President of the United States. It's a tremendously different thing. If he made a slip of the tongue, some ministry could fall in Asia or something like that. And he just had to be terribly careful. And I think it turned out to be a tougher job even than he had realized. But he certainly tried at it to the very last. I think he accomplished a great deal. More than I can think of any other president, assuming he had an agenda, achieving of his agenda. And as I said, I think he was a true believer. I think he did it because, as Peggy Noonan says in her book, he really believed in it.
What do you think was his greatest achievement?
Well, you'd have to choose among several. Cutting the income tax rate is terribly important. We see even today that the Democrats are strategically crippled by their inability or unwillingness to raise those income tax rates. If you haven't got the poker chips, you can't play the game, you see. So in a sense, that was a tremendously important achievement. Then again, as we see now, I think unquestionably his buildup of the American defenses and the threat of SDI, which left the Russians realizing that if it was carried out, their their huge missiles would be worthless and they would have to spend more than they had spent on them to get an SDI of their own. It sort of broke their hearts a little bit. And thirdly, you could say that, I think there's something to be said for it, that almost his biggest achievement was a kind of a moral achievement. He made America, after Vietnam and after Watergate and after Carter's talk about malaise, feel a little bit proud of itself again. And that's a lot to do for a country.
Let's go through these points. I want to look at the first point. What do you say to a liberal or an opponent of conservatism who says, yes, but let's look at those deficits? I mean, he paid a very heavy price that we in part will have to pay for, but most especially our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren.
Well, I'll tell you about our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I'm delighted to have the liberals as worried as they are these days about their great-grandchildren paying the price of this deficit. But do remember that what we pay is not the deficit, the principal. We pay the interest. That's the main. And the interest is a very big item, the second largest in the budget now. No, I'm not going to defend, nor is Reagan, whom I talk to and whose views I know, going to defend the deficit. But you must remember that every president is confronted with options. And it's a trade-off. He either was going to rebuild the defenses of the United States, or he was going to have a low deficit and a balanced budget. He either was going to cut taxes and let the economy get on the roll it's been on ever since, or he was going to have that deficit. He opted for the deficit. And when one talks about its long-term deleterious aspects, the one that hurts most is the servicing of the debt, the interest on the debt. But if you look at the debt, or even the servicing on it, as a percentage of gross national product, you will find this country has kept on growing, and that the deficit, certainly the debt, the actual annual deficits, are diminishing as a percentage of gross national product, as well as absolutely under the Gramm-Rudman guidelines. So I think, frankly, that it's a little comical to me. I've been around long enough to remember the Democrats back when they could have cared less about deficits, and I'm delighted to have them worry about them, but I think they're worried mostly because they've got so little else to worry about.
What about the social conditions that we're now having to confront? I mean, there are any number of problems, the problems of the homeless, problems of things like our capacity to provide daycare. I mean, there's a whole agenda, which obviously is not your agenda. What I'm curious about is some parts of that agenda really do harken back to a conservative tradition in the sense of taking care of the whole of the community and so on. Is there any connection there between the two, that is, the needs that we're experiencing and the responsibilities that even the traditional conservatism call for?
No question that we have a serious, take your homeless, which is probably the paradigmatic problem. It's a serious problem, and it's just as serious for conservatives as it is for liberals, and we have just as many ideas, or maybe more, about what to do about them. But let's first of all understand, it's a little disingenuous of the liberals to say, when I look at all the homeless that suddenly appeared during the Reagan administration all over the streets. The homeless are a product of several things that have been happening over decades in the American society. We always had a marginal group of alcoholics out on the streets in the Bowery in New York and so on. Bums, we call them, hobos, whatnot. But beyond that, when the drug culture came in, no question that this increased that problem enormously, as well as the crime problem. And then certain therapeutic drugs became available, and it became one of the great ambitions of, among others, the American Civil Liberties Union to deinstitutionalize the mentally ill. They thought they were doing them a favor. So now we have all those people out on the street talking to imaginary people on the sidewalk and one thing and another. And all of this is called Reagan's callous contribution to the problem of the homeless, which just is not. Now, what do you do about this? Well, you do not simply provide nice little ranch-style houses for all these people. You could put them all up in the Trump Tower, and it would be a crack den in about a week. You know that. There are various things. One man who spent a lot of time in private efforts to help on this told me that one of the problems is the disintegration of the family. He said it used to be that a great many of these people, alcoholics, drug addicts, mentally ill, would be taken care of in one way or another by their families, but there's no family to take care of them now in that sense. So that, again, that has happened. You're going to have to, well, the drug, let's just take that. The drug problem, I happen to think, is a problem of eliminating or reducing the demand. I don't see that the supply is anything but a function of the demand. They'll get through if the demand is here. But the demand in turn, well, I think we are having some effect. I don't think that Bennett's program is altogether without effect. If the statistics we hear about the decline in the use of marijuana in high schools is true, and so we're getting maybe somewhere in that regard.
But does government, I mean, I hear you saying that does government have a responsibility here?
Well,
but you're saying it's only external, to go after the source, really, to find the place.
Government has a responsibility to do what government can do to make things better. That doesn't mean that throwing money at problems or creating a czar for some problem is automatically the best way to handle it. And I don't think that is the case in many of these situations. In the particular case of drugs, unless you go for decriminalization, which is Bill Buckley's solution, but not mine, I think you have to say that one government function is certainly to attack as best we can the whole question of the demand. But I'm interested to see that here in California, the state has launched a $27 million advertising campaign to badmouth tobacco. But what would happen if anybody tried to spend that amount of money on a campaign against drugs in California, do you suppose? I have a hunch Willie Brown would not let that through the legislature. He wouldn't have much trouble.
Why not? I mean, why?
Because this is the fashionable vice. Tobacco is the middle class disease, but a little pot, a little crack, these are things that younger and different social categories have found out and go for, and they are, for the moment, untouchable, I think.
What about the social responsibility, though, in the traditional conservatism? Does that tradition find its outlet in the notion of voluntarism? I mean, in other words,
among others,
that would be the primary place to look.
No, I think there is an important critique being made. You take all the books of Charles Murray, for example, are brilliant analyses of what's wrong with the liberal solutions to the welfare problem. But take Aid to Families with Dependent Children, which is a well-intentioned program, started by the liberals with a view to helping mostly, although not exclusively, black families. But the way it's set up, the only people who can benefit under it are women without husbands, basically, so that if there is a man in the picture, the first thing he's got to do is get out of sight or leave his home in order to qualify his woman for the money. In other words, this became the great subsidy of the destruction of the black two-parent family in America. The result is we've got 61% single-parent families in black America. Now, this is a tragedy. And if the conservatives do nothing except try to put a stop to that, they are making a big step in the right direction. As Kemp has said, Jack Kemp, if you subsidize something, you get more of it. If you tax it, you get less of it.
Let's talk a little about foreign policy and Reagan's contribution there. You made the argument that he won the Cold War
well, it's a little simplistic. I don't want to make a sweeping statement like that. I think that one of his great contributions, let's put it this way, I don't think that the Soviet Union would have been quite so ready to pack it in if Michael Dukakis or Jimmy Carter had been presiding over the decade of the 80s.
So it wasn't really inevitable. I mean, we had to have the buildup, really, to achieve the result?
Inevitable. I happen to think the Cold War at various points was a very near thing.
Mm-hmm. In the sense that the outcome could have gone either way.
Absolutely, absolutely. In recent years, I think the Soviet Union, by which I mean the last 6 to 8 years, the Soviet Union has economically gone into a tailspin, which was probably inevitable, but in any case has happened now. But I think that facing Reagan, Thatcher, and Kohl has not done their morale any good.
That's right. But from your perspective, the Cold War is over?
I think so. I don't want to be a Pollyanna, and I'm certainly not about to dash out and spend some peace dividend I'm not sure is there, but I am not one of these conspiratorial conservatives who think it's all a plot to get our technology, no.
And when do you think, we had the proof, the evidence? Reagan seemed to see the evidence in his last year in office. Do you think he was prescient in that sense?
Yeah, well, he had better information. He said to me in, I think, about 1985 or 6, when I was in the Oval Office preparing to interview him. We were sitting as you and I are, and they were fiddling around with the cameras and the lights and one thing and another. We were waiting to get going, and we were talking, and he said, speaking of the Soviet Union, he said their economy is a basket case. Now, he turned out to be right on target there. Well, he had an awful lot of information the rest of us didn't have, I suppose, but he at least had the ability to know important information when it passed under his nose, and he singled out that as the...
What was the convincing event for you that...
I think the Berlin Wall. It was the great obvious thing, a symbol. It was not when it actually happened. A friend of mine told me about a book he once read by an American colonel, Air Force colonel, on the psychology of individual dogfights in battle. And the point at which one of the two fighters wins is not necessarily when you think it is. It's when the other becomes convinced that he's going to lose, you see. At that point, the air goes out of him. And at some point further back, Gorbachev and company reached that conclusion. We don't know when. It may have been when they found out that Japan was about to exceed them in gross national product.
That's right. And some people have said that when they discovered they couldn't make a Hyundai, is another possibility. Is this conclusion universal within the conservative movement?
Not quite.
Yeah.
There are a few holdouts, although they're getting quieter and fewer.
And what is the basis of their position, do you feel?
Suspicion.
I mean, suspicion.
They just don't trust communists, and if some communist grips his side and says, "Help, I am slain," they are very careful about dashing up to help.
Were East European emigres, you mentioned this earlier, and were really important to helping the conservatives focus on anti-communism as a problem, so that in fact this would become help us understand better the acceptance in some way. I mean, Eastern Europe was really a key element in alerting us to the threat. What happened to Eastern Europe in the late 40s?
Well, the happened when?
I mean, in alerting us to the threat in the 40s, basically, what the fate of Eastern Europe was critical.
Well, I think the Cold War began when Harry Truman decided he couldn't take what Stalin was doing with Eastern Europe. You're quite right, and Poland in particular.
What should our policy be now to the Soviet Union? Do we want it to break apart? Do we want it to push it completely against the wall, or do we have any kind of interest the other way now?
I suppose that if we had our druthers, the perfect thing would be for Gorbachev and those around him to decide that what they wanted was a democratic society with a market economy, and to make a few little adjustments and bring around the Soviet Union to that situation. Unfortunately, I don't think that can be done. I wish devoutly it could be. But I'm afraid that a society as profoundly dirigiste as the Soviet one, with all the psychological pressures of 70 years against anybody who makes anything of himself or shows the slightest ambition or makes a profit, which is an evil word to them, I'm afraid that that makes it impossible. I'm afraid that we're going to have to see something very much like a total collapse and almost razing of the ground, followed by the slow build-up of a new society. So it isn't a question of what I want Gorbachev to do or to succeed. I don't think he has much of a chance.
What should our position be toward the various nationality groups that seek autonomy? We're obviously confronting the crisis in Lithuania.
In general, we favor self-determination of peoples, and that cuts against the Soviet state as it currently exists. I don't think the Soviet state's very long for this world. I think somebody said that all of the component republics, including the Russian Republic, want to secede from it, and I think they will gradually over a period of time.
Do you think that we should in any way support gradualism on the part of these movements, or morally would it be?
We are supporting gradualism.
Well, do you think that's a good idea?
That's got to be a judgment call in each case.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Lithuania coming first, Gorbachev feels that he has to make some kind of a demonstration there in favor of gradualism, or the whole ball game will be over before he can get back to the Kremlin.
Mm-hmm.
So and probably I would be rather sympathetic to letting him insist upon gradualism, although it is perfectly true that, morally speaking, there's no case to be made for gradualism.
What is your view of his leadership? Are you impressed by what he's achieved and the way he's gone about doing it?
I'm impressed, but I'm also puzzled. One has to ask, why is he doing it? Is he the designated hitter of a group? Is he a sole operator who's doing this on his own? If he is, what is he doing? Does he have a plan, or is he, as we now historians tend to think Franklin Roosevelt was, rather an improviser who just sort of would endorse anything that came along and looked like it might work, you know? Undoubtedly, what history thinks about Gorbachev is largely going to be a function of how he turns out, either well or badly, a fool or genius. But and most of his accomplishments, whether he likes it or not, are negative. He has been an enormous destructive force on the Soviet Union. He has disassembled it brick by brick. And he's done it from the inside, looking out. Somebody has said, and while there are troubles with the analogy, it's not altogether unlike some pope suddenly losing his faith and going around and telling everybody that there's nothing to all this, you know.
So do you think our support, and that is undefined, but I mean, is important for his survival?
I don't think we really have that much to do with his survival as a political proposition. He seems to be pretty much of a survivor, but it's quite possible that there are forces in the society that can bring him down. I don't think just the announcement of American loan or something like that's going to save his bacon.
I want to get back to the philosophical underpinnings of the movement, because both in your biography and in your analysis of the conservative movement, anti-communism was a critical pillar.
That's where I came from.
Right, but historically, I think one can say that both anti-communism and the Soviet threat, at key moments in the history of the movement, were important.
Well, they certainly were important, and very important. But on the other hand, I am in this sense a convert to the conservative movement, that I came to it from anti-communism, but I paid attention to what Kirk was saying about traditionalism and what Meyer was saying about libertarianism and about fusionism, the bringing of the two together, and of the importance of the coalition, so that I became, I think, a pretty well annealed conservative all along the line, and anti-communism is just one aspect of that.
Because my question is, what happens when that issue passes from the scene? Hopefully it is. The Cold War is over, you know, the adversary is defeated, and in fact one of Gorbachev's advisors said, "We will deny you your enemy," namely, you know. What happens to the movement?
Well, to begin with, as I guess we've already established, it's a complex movement that contains many conceivably even inconsistent parts. so that the impact of the end of the Cold War on them is going to differ. I can't see why the religious right, to take just one example out of half a dozen, should suddenly lose whatever connection it has with the conservative movement merely because the Cold War is over. And they've got millions of votes. I can't see why the libertarians, unless they go way off to the end and support the Libertarian Party, but then what might be called the sensible libertarians should suddenly, just because the Cold War is over, stop supporting the conservative movement. On the other hand, I can imagine that it would be an interesting question to what extent neoconservatives, of course they came in mostly in reaction to the New Left, not to the Cold War, although they are pretty strong.
Some did. I mean,
yes.
some in response to the Cold War, yeah.
Some, yeah. They might be influenced to some extent. My own feeling is that basically the conservative coalition is a coalition not against communism so much as against liberalism. And that as long as liberalism is around, even in its present debilitated state, it will provide the glue to hold the coalition together. I think if liberalism were to disappear in any serious, as it may, eventually just sort of wither away, then obviously you'd be facing a new state of affairs, and some of these old fights, like the lowering of the lake of communism in Eastern Europe has raised the old rocks of Germany and other things which were there all the time but were hidden. The differences then between libertarians and traditionalists might start breaking out. I can see that off in the distance.
Does the conservative movement have a new foreign policy agenda that we might touch on, or is that not still unfocused yet?
Flapping around like everybody else at the moment.
Right.
We like to think that we are that the principles of conservatism can be applied to whatever problems come along, Germany or whatever, Japan. We're free traders and we intend to remain free traders.
Is that universal in the movement? I mean, is there...
Again, not quite. A movement as big as ours has virtually everything in it, but I think you can count on conservatism if it remains true to itself, to remain true to that.
Might Germany or Japan be a military threat?
They might, they aren't yet, and I can see many reasons why they would not. I don't raise it as a bugaboo, but certainly it's got to be watched. I don't agree with Francis Fukuyama that history's come to an end. We're going to go right on having more of it, as Aldous Huxley, in his inimitable definition, said he didn't believe, you know, in cyclical things. He said history is just one damned thing after another.
Are there any lessons in the history of the conservative movement for those former communist states that are in some sort of a transition to the market? What would those lessons be? How could conservatives be helpful either in their ideology?
Some have already been over there and have received very warm receptions. You'll notice that, contrary to all expectations, East Germany voted, in effect, conservatively rather than socialistically in its first free elections. A friend of mine who has been to Moscow and talked with the interregional group of deputies, which are the real opposition, a minor opposition, only about 200 votes in the big chamber, says that they are way past socialism and thoroughly capitalistic in all their impulses now.
And might there be...
And we would be able to give them the benefit of what advice we can.
Right. But there really isn't a map that you have with regard to
getting from here to there.
Right.
Now that's the difficult part. There we've got a good picture. Our shining city is there, and they know it's there, and they want to get there. Getting there is not going to be half the fun in this particular case. It's going to be almost all agony. And as I said, I don't see really any way to avoid it.
Are you bothered by the fact that we haven't been able to take a leading position in providing aid, government to government or government to private groups, because of these deficits that we have in the debate?
As a matter of fact, I think it's rather to the good. With exceptions, I don't think that what these people need is aid, financial aid from the United States. What they've got to do is reorganize their societies. And we might actually, by giving them aid, inhibit the process.
Mm-hmm. So that in a way it's more our example.
Yes,
That's really the.
If if there's any truth to the principles we live by, we can tell them the principles,
mm-hmm.
but they've got to live by them.
Are conservatives generally, and yourself in particular, internationalists, and do you remain internationalists? I mean, once we lose the Soviet threat, might the old isolationist wing of conservatism combine with the libertarian wing and move the United States to a situation where it turns inward?
There's a streak of isolationism in the American people, first of all, which to some degree can be detected in the conservative movement and to some degree on the left, by the way. The people up there in North and South Dakota and Minnesota, that neck of the woods, have a good deal of that in them on the liberal side. But I don't think, given the world we've got and as interrelated as it is, that this is going to be a big matter. I've been very encouraged to see the extent to which in very recent years members of the conservative movement have started reaching out and networking with conservatives abroad. Mm-hmm. The liberals were way, way ahead of us on this, but we're getting there, and we now know who the leading conservatives are in France and Germany and Britain and Japan and so on. And we're in touch with them, and they don't always agree with us. Their histories are different. But there's much more contact going on, and I think that will keep us international.
Do you think that the competitive problems that we face in the international economy will require any kind of reorientation of conservative views of the role of government?
If conservatism is right, and I think it is, then by the correct application of conservative principles, we're going to be able to do the best we can with whatever we've got in the way of problems ahead, not just by dashing to big government and asking for help, certainly on either tariffs or subsidies or anything of that sort. That's exactly the wrong way to go.
What lesson would you like to be drawn from this history of the movement that we've just walked through? Any in particular stand out about the relation of ideas and politics?
I can do this rather well. I gather it's sort of a conclusory question.
Yes.
I can tell you how I conclude many of my talks because it fits very well. Yes, I've lived long enough, and I must say I didn't expect to live long enough to see a great many things happen. When Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, I thought that was the culmination. Then he was re-elected, and I thought that was. And now, a few more years later on, the Berlin Wall falls down and the Soviet Union crumples. And so we have some reason to believe that the principles we have fought for and lived by have stood the test of time. And there's a wonderful little quatrain that I close my talks with by Coventry Patmore, the 19th century British poet, which sums the point up. And very reassuringly, he says, "For want of me, the world's course will not fail. When all its work is done, the lie shall rot. The truth is great and shall prevail when none cares whether it prevail or not."
Well, on that note of poetry, I want to thank you very much for joining us today for this
it's been a pleasure.
Very interesting historical tour, I guess one would say, of a very important movement, and obviously your role was very important in it.
My compliments on a good job of questioning. That's a free commercial. He didn't ask for it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Rusher, and thank you very much for joining us for this conversation on international affairs.